Hi everyone, it's Miss Nikolai, and welcome to our screencast on background of the Harlem Renaissance. So, just for some quick background, the Harlem Renaissance writers are the last group that we're going to look at in our modernism unit. And so you might be thinking, well, what do they have in common with Anza Yezierska and the Great Gatsby and the modern poets that we started off our unit with? Great questions. And the thing they have in common is that all of these writers are trying to envision the world as a better place. So there's a focus on the dream, a refusal to submit to the way the world is, but this idea of using art to create beauty, something that's better than the world that they see around themselves. And that's true for the Harlem Renaissance as well. Now, you may have read about the Harlem Renaissance in your history classes, and so this may be a quick review. We're going to go pretty quickly through some of the history, but feel free to pause the screencast, take some notes, write down what helps you understand. So here we go. A Harlem Renaissance, a cultural movement of the 1920s. Now, as you probably know, Renaissance means rebirth, and the Harlem Renaissance takes on that term because it's a rebirth of Black culture. It was a huge flowering of African American culture that took place around 1920 to 1935. And this reflects all of art: literature, music, dance, philosophy. We see really amazing things created during this time period. So we're going to focus a little bit on the 1920s, and then as we move forward with our writers, move into the early 30s. So if we say that in our class that art grows from culture, what was going on during this time? Now, we're just post World War I, and we've talked about some of the reactions of individuals who fought in World War I with Nick Adams and Nick Carraway, but we haven't spoken about Black fighters who came back to the United States after serving for their country. So they came back with an expectation that they would find some equality and ways of advancing in society, but instead, what they were met with was racism. And so between 1915 and 1920, about 1 million Black individuals migrated from the South to the North. This was known as the Northern Migration. And it took place as individuals faced in the South Jim Crow laws and other injustices, prejudice. They went north for job opportunities, to escape some of the violence and unequal voting rights that took place. You may remember reading a little bit about this when you discussed Raisin in the Sun freshman year. Along this time, the movie Birth of a Nation came out, and this was a very racist film that until the second half of the 20th century was actually the highest grossing film. And you can Google this film. It's a pretty gross depiction of society in the South, which shows fears of Black individuals taking control. Now, after this movie came out, there was a rise in the Ku Klux Klan and a rise of a lot of violence and lynchings against Black individuals in the South. And that was one of the things that spurred the Northern Migration. And in response to that, we also have the new Negro movement developing, basically claiming dignity and power, or attempt to gain power for Black individuals in the United States. So, this new spirit of optimism was meant to contrast with some of the racism and prejudice that individuals felt. And a lot of it took place in Harlem, hence the Harlem Renaissance. So there was this idea of the new Negro, and this came from an essay written by Alan Locke in 1925. And in this essay, Alan Locke argued that the new Negro needed to be optimistic, powerful, and intelligent. He wanted to smash stereotypes of inferior ex-slaves and replace them with images of Black people who were the culture bearers and who were able to promote a really wonderful, vibrant culture. This new spirit was proud, militant, not submissive. It focused on group identity and also had its roots of Black pride, oftentimes stemming to Africa. Alan Locke was the first African American Rhodes Scholar, and he was really the philosophical architect of the Harlem Renaissance. So his essay, as I mentioned, came out in 1925. Now, before that, Marcus Garvey was an individual who planted political seeds of race consciousness in a book called Negro World. W.E. Du Bois was a Black philosopher who also laid out a foundation for this new spirit of optimism. So the key thing here is to think about that this was a very purposeful, philosophy-driven approach to creating a new culture and Black identity. So the goals of the Harlem Renaissance, and these are goals that we can see in Alan Locke's work and we can see in some other Black writers, to use art as a way to provide for self-expression and spiritual liberation. Also, art to foster a sense of identity, to provide a window into Black life, and to improve living conditions for African American. So these are 4 goals that Harlem Renaissance writers, artists, painters, musicians really tried to espouse in their work. And the purpose of this is to create Black heroes, to really inspire racial pride and fight against racist stereotypes of the Sambo, the mammy, or happy-go-lucky individuals who are happy with a lack of power in society. So when we look at some of the artwork and when we look at some of the poetry, look for these 4 goals. Subjects, themes, topics to look for that you're going to see. Now this painting right here is from Aaron Douglas's work. It's called The Negro in an African Setting. And it's an example of how artists would go to Africa for pride, and you can see individuals dancing in a group. These are warriors. If you think back again to Raisin in the Sun, this is similar to the beginning of Act 2 when Benitha and Walter are dancing to the Nigerian music that Asagi has brought in. So there's this idea of joy and power that would have been a rebuttal to the subservient views of individuals, Black individuals during this time. And you might see those ideas subject in the themes of Africa as a source of pride, the use of Black folk traditions, the use of political propaganda, and this idea of a candid self-realization, this feeling of who am I and who can I become, as opposed to having a label put upon me. So these are some of the things that we're going to see in the work. And it's all set to some really cool jazz and blue rhythms. Now, jazz, as you may know from history, comes or is rooted in Black spirituals that would have been sung by enslaved individuals on plantations. And in the 1920s, we had a huge flourishing of this type of music. And it is very different than the traditional poetry that with succinct rhymes and rhythm that traditional poets might have espoused. So we're going to see some of that in the poetry as well. Okay, speaking of music, you're going to see the blues. And next week, we'll talk a little bit about some blues music as an outlet for expressing the hardships of life. This is going to be the music of Billie Holiday and Bessie Smith. And we're also going to see jazz, rooted in traditional African American music, spirituals. And this is Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and other individuals who were part of big band tradition. You can see some pioneers here. Josephine Baker on this list was a great dancer. You may remember her from the presentation we had at the last prayer service. And spoke about the dancer Josephine Baker, and also Billie Holiday, another great artist. We'll be listening to some of her music a little bit later. Okay, this is a map of the Cotton Club, and the Cotton Club was one of the most vibrant places in Harlem where Black performers musicians and dancers would perform. Here are some examples of some of the dancers. You can see right here, Duke Ellington. You can see this is Josephine Baker, Louis Armstrong. This is going to be Billie Holiday and Bessie Smith. Now, some of the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. So we're going to talk about poetry in a second. We've talked a little bit about some musicians. So we're going to look at some artwork. And you're going to have a chance in the second part of the web quest to put your impressions of the art. But look and see if you can see some connections between these paintings and some of the themes that we've talked about. This idea of joy, a group identity, and not taking on a subservient role by anyone. Even though there's a cop in the foreground here, this individual is not having any impact on what's going on in the background. This is a very famous painting by the Harlem Renaissance called Aspiration, and you're going to have a chance to give some of your thoughts on this painting a little bit later, analyzing some of the images. But when you do that, look and see what's going on at the bottom of this particular painting, what's here. look at these symbols here and look at what is on this hill. And this um, place on a hill should be somewhat familiar to you, some of the imagery we've talked about with American Lit. You're also going to have a chance to look at this painting by Lois Mailou Jones. Again, look at the hill, look at this image here, and think about what this star might represent, because you'll have a chance to share some of your opinions a little later. Okay, that takes us to our poet for today, James Weldon Johnson, who you'll be looking at a couple of his poems. His dates are 1871 to 1938, and you can see a summary of his bio in your reader on page 147. His timeline date for us, which will be the same for all of our Harlem Renaissance poets, is 1920. He was born in Florida in the middle class, and he actually was one of 3 children in a pretty well-off family. And he was highly educated. He completed college, he became a Florida school principal, he studied law. He actually was the first Black individual to pass the bar exam in Florida. But he still was somewhat frustrated by lack of opportunity that he saw for him in Florida. And so he moved to New York, and he wanted to work in the theater with his brother, who became his co-writer for Lift Every Voice and Sing. Now, he was one of the founders of the NAACP. His first novel was entitled Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, and he ultimately turned towards poetry as a form of expression. In fact, he wrote a book of poems called God's Trombones, in which he transformed traditional Bible stories into poems, into verse, and he called them Negro sermons. So you're going to have a chance to look at how he transforms a poem a little bit later next Monday as well. He wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing, which we know today as the Black National Anthem, and you're going to have a chance a little bit later to learn a little bit more about that individual, about that song, that poem. And you should know also that in 1922, he was the editor of one of the first anthologies of African American poetry. The book was entitled The Book of American Negro Poetry. So really prolific man. I'm excited for you to get a chance to look at some of his poems in the second half of our session today. Well, everybody, that's it. And I hope this is helpful for you. And good luck on part 2.